Well, welcome back to Sunday Evening Devotions. It does seem appropriate that after the week of celebrating Valentine's Day that we take up the subject of marriage and, related to it, divorce. Now, this is quite a controversial subject in our day, not only because divorce laws and rules have greatly been diminished so that one can get a divorce for almost any reason, but also the very confusion about what marriage is and who can be married. And I think it all reflects again upon the fact that our culture is becoming more and more a culture of pagan immorality. The Bible itself, both the Old Testament law and its regulations to the Mosaic system, the Torah, but as well as the book of Genesis and the New Testament, so that whole Judeo-Christian ethic upon which Western culture is founded, clearly teaches us that God is the one who has instituted marriage. He's ordained it. And we find that in God's institution of this ordinance for benefit of humankind, that marriage is to be between one man and one woman only. And while that's not necessarily a popular thing anymore, that is nonetheless the truth. And I think common sense would even dictate that to us. We all know it instinctively, but in our search for self-gratification, we have tried to redefine all kinds of things in our day. Now, this is particularly clear in the Old Testament in Genesis 2:24, where God brings Eve to Adam, and we find those words that the two shall become one flesh. They're to be joined together, this man and this woman. God has established it. Jesus makes reference as well in Matthew chapter 19 when he's asked the question if someone could divorce his wife for any reason. And Jesus says, well, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. And therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate. Note again, marriage is based on what God has brought together. It is He who has done this. And note also the singular here. It is one man and one woman, male and female. And this is the point, that there is to be one man and one woman in this male-female relationship, and they are brought together and by God's ordinance and made in this marriage union one flesh. There is a unity here that happens. And so even though the Old Testament records the facts that Old Testament kings and others had multiple wives, that was not God's plan, or that was not God's purpose. That was sin. And Jesus reminds us that in God's plan of things, that indeed it was one man and one woman. So marriage then is ordained by God for the mutual benefit of husband and wife, for the propagation of humanity, and with legitimate offspring, as well in the church, a holy seed as it's often called, but children in the church who are brought up to be believers and followers of the Lord Jesus Christ. And of course, marriage is given, as we know and understand, to put a fence around sexual relations. That is, it prevents perversion. It prevents sexual sin. We all have those sexual urges. We're made that way as creatures, and they're for a holy end. But where sin is, it always seeks to pervert those good things. And so we're told here that marriage is the confines in which those feelings and expressions ought to be expressed. Marriage, then, is for the honor and of God's institution, and the honor and maintenance of marriage as ordained by God is as important in our day because, well, of all the sexual license that's going on and the perversion which is undermining, I believe, family and society as a whole. Marriage is ordained for all sorts of people. It's not a sacrament of the church. The church doesn't control marriage. It is a creation ordinance. In other words, it's made for all of humanity. Certainly, God has spiritual lessons for us to learn in marriage, as Paul even makes reflection on about the relationship between Christ and his church. But marriage itself is for humanity in general. And therefore, it is available to all who can give honest and true consent and commitment to it. And it is the duty, however, of Christians particularly to marry in the Lord. That is, believers ought to marry only believers in Jesus Christ. And violation of this particular point usually gets the believer in trouble. And so God warns us that we should marry believers with believers. And as we think about divorce, that is the result of living in a sinful world. And so, as Jesus even remarked in Matthew 19, that it wasn't God's design that there should be divorce, but because of the hardness of their hearts. That is, because our hearts are hardened with sin, and there's unrepentant sin. And so as we study the Scriptures, the only right grounds for divorce are adultery or fornication, sexual sin, and sort of a irretrievable and willful desertion of one spouse by the other. And on those two occasions, then, only is the other spouse seen as innocent of those things and can remarry. Now, that's pretty restrictive, and most people don't like those kinds of ideas. We find marriage to be often difficult because it's a training ground. It teaches us humility, and we have to work at it, and we often want the easy way out of our difficulties. But God calls us to a higher calling, and I would urge you, as you teach your children, but also as you live your life, that you would take up the commitment of marriage for the honor and glory of God, for the maintenance of this holy institution that God has ordained, that He would be made known, and that love would be purified, and that you would grow in grace. Because after all, it is by grace that we are saved. It is by grace that our marriages continue. It is by grace, God's grace, that these blessings are given to us. It is the grace of God through the work of Jesus Christ. And that is good news. Good night.